Hello, it's me, Christine. Welcome to my little crime corner. We are back in the Lone Star State today. Somehow we always find our way back here. There must be something in the water. Crime, perhaps? We are specifically in the southernmost part of Texas to meet a young woman named Irene Garza, who unfortunately met an untimely demise. Irene Garza was born to Nicholas and Josephina Garza in McAllen, Texas in 1934. Her parents owned and operated a dry cleaning business for several years, and by the time Irene was in her teens, the family had moved to the north side of the city, which was a more affluent part of town. Irene was active in her high school's majorette and twirling teams, and she regularly participated in beauty pageants. In 1958, she was crowned Miss All South Texas Sweetheart, which sounds very prestigious, and attended Pan American College, where she won Homecoming Queen. After her pageant and college career, Irene taught second grade at a local elementary school. Irene was very outgoing for her students, but her friends knew her to be more on the shy side. She had credited her students and her work for her joy and fulfillment in life. As she advanced in her career, she had become more confident and had recently become secretary of the PTA. As devoted as she was to her family and students, she was even more devoted to her faith. As a lifelong Catholic, she was a faithful member to the Legion of Mary and attended Mass and Communion daily. On the evening of April 16th, 1960, Irene told her parents that she was going to confession at the Sacred Heart Church. Irene was living with her parents at the time, and when she didn't come home after a while, they had assumed that she was staying to attend the midnight mass. However, by 3 a.m., she still wasn't home. They became very worried since this certainly was not like her. They then went to the police department to report her missing. They knew that she definitely attended church that evening because several parishioners remembered seeing her there. 2 days later, Irene's purse, left shoe, and lace veil were found, spread out over several hundred yards along a stretch of road in McAllen. At that point, police and volunteers began a search larger than any other in the Rio Grande Valley at the time. There was a hopeful moment when Irene's parents got a phone call from a woman claiming to be Irene, telling them that she had been kidnapped and taken to a hotel in the nearby town of Hidalgo, but the call turned out to be a hoax. Another instance where they got a possible clue was a man bragging to his waitress in Edinburgh, another nearby town, that he had killed Irene, but when they looked into it further, they had found out that he was just very drunk and making a joke. Disgusting. 3 days later, on April 21st, Irene's body was found in a canal several miles away from where her effects were found earlier that week. During her autopsy, the medical examiner determined that she had died from suffocation. He had found evidence that she had also been raped while she was unconscious, and her face had been severely beaten. Because her body was found in the canal, any evidence, such as blood or hair, would have unfortunately washed away. especially because of the length of time she was there. In total, more than 500 people were questioned by police across several Texas cities. They questioned Irene's family members, her friends and her coworkers, her ex-boyfriends, as well as several known sex offenders in the area. Among these many questioned persons, police conducted almost 50 polygraph examinations and offered a $2,500 reward for any information on her murder. At the time, this was the most amount offered in the Rio Grande Valley region for information on a murder. Shortly after, a Texas businessman posted an additional $10,000 reward leading to any information on Irene's death. Fairly early on in the investigation, a priest from Irene's church came up on police's radar. He was the priest who had heard Irene's last confession, and police were eager to speak with him. His name was John Fite, and he was only 27 years old and had been placed at the McAllen Church after he had completed his seminary training in San Antonio. The reason he was so interesting to police was based on the accounts of several church members. Apparently, John's confession line had moved very slowly on the night of Irene's disappearance, and that John had actually left the sanctuary several times that night. After initially denying it, it was later revealed that John had taken Irene to the church's rectory to hear her confession that night. Fellow priests had told police that it was unusual for John to take anybody to the rectory to hear their confession. They also made statements to police detailing how John had scratch marks on his hands after that night's midnight mass. A slide viewer, which is one of those little photo viewers with the button that you click down and the slide changes and it goes around and you can see all the pictures. Anyone born after 1993 probably doesn't know what I'm talking about, but a slide viewer was found upon draining the canal, and this was later confirmed as belonging to John. The police said that when they had first spoken with John at the station, they had given him a polygraph test, which initially they said he passed, but later said that the results were inconclusive. More on this later. He was then confronted about the fact that he had lied about taking Irene to the rectory to hear her confession. He reluctantly admitted that he had in fact taken her back to the rectory and said that he had left the sanctuary because he had broken his glasses that night. He made a statement along the lines of he regularly nervously played with his glasses while listening to confessions. He said that he had left the church and drove to his home, which was nearby, to retrieve another pair, but he didn't have his keys on him at the time and had to climb in through a second-story window, scratching his hands and arms on the brickwork in the process. Because John was already on their radar, police learned of an instance just 3 weeks before Irene's murder. A woman named Maria Guerrera had been sexually assaulted while kneeling at a communion rail at a McAllen area Catholic church. There was a rumor that John was responsible, but local church leaders had discouraged their parishioners from even considering the possibility that a priest could have been involved, let alone responsible for such an attack. When questioned, John admitted to having met with another priest at the church the very day Maria had been assaulted, but had vehemently denied having anything to do with it. John was later charged with rape, but the trial ended with a hung jury. Several months later, rather than entering a second trial, John had pleaded no contest for a misdemeanor charge for aggravated assault and paid a $500 fine. At the time, he did not realize that by pleading no contest, this was admitting guilt and considered a conviction. He later said that he did not understand what he was pleading for or what it meant. I wonder what would have happened if this had gone to trial a second time. I bet we're all thinking the same thing. Because of how the trial went, John was sent to the Assumption Abbey, which was a Trappist monastery in Missouri. One of the abbots at the monastery had told a monk that John had killed someone and asked him to counsel him for a few months to see if he had the disposition and ability to become a monk. I can tell you right now, no. John had confessed to him that he had killed a young woman and admitted to hurting another young woman. The confession went unreported to authorities for several years because the abbot said it was not his job to judge John at the time. I would like this guy investigated as well. Who do I have to call? Things ended up not working out at the monastery since John didn't feel comfortable with the whole monastic lifestyle, and he was then sent to a treatment center for troubled priests in New Mexico. The facility was run by the Servants of Paraclete, and John had eventually worked his way up to a supervisor position there. While there, a priest named Father James Porter garnered a lot of attention as it had come to light that he had molested as many as 100 children. He was later defrocked, however, not before John had cleared him for placement to another parish. Just disgusting. I don't know if he started to feel his conscience catching up with him or something was going on in his head, but John decided to leave the priesthood in 1970. Shortly after leaving, he got married and started a family in Phoenix, Arizona. He continued to work in some capacity with the Catholic Church, volunteering with the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, which was a food charity, for several years. Many years had passed since Irene's tragic murder, with no one facing any consequences or being brought to justice. Until, in 2002, the abbot from the monastery in Missouri felt that he could no longer keep John's confession a secret, and he called San Antonio police. The investigation into Irene's murder was then reopened later that year. Investigators then got in touch with the other priests that were at the church John was serving at the time and found that one of the priests, Father Joseph O'Brien, had told a television reporter in 2000 that he didn't know anything, but had admitted to him that John had confessed to murdering Irene shortly after her murder. Later that same year, the polygraph examiner who had initially tested John in 1960 was adamant that he had failed the test. He said that he had always questioned the results and said that the initial report that said he had passed was later edited to say the results were inconclusive. The district attorney of Hidalgo County from the 1980s to 2014, Irene Garza, decided not to bring the case before a jury until 2004. The earlier questioned priests, the monks, and John didn't receive subpoenas in the case, and the jury decided to indict John. The DA was reluctant to reopen this case, as it had been revealed that Father O'Brien was suffering from dementia when he was questioned, and the amount of physical evidence, or lack thereof, to him was unsatisfying. Father O'Brien had passed away in 2005. It wasn't until 2014 when the next wave of progress occurred. A district court judge named Ricardo Rodriguez had campaigned against the current DA, Irene Garza, and had spoken about Irene's murder case as a campaign issue, and said that if elected, he promised that a new look would be taken in her case. He wanted justice for her family and believed there would be some resolution upon further investigation. He did end up winning the election, and just days after his victory, he had announced he would take a new look at the evidence once he took control of the DA's office in January 2015. In April of that year, he announced that Irene's case was open again. In February 2016, John Fite was arrested in Scottsdale, Arizona. At the time of his arrest, he was 83 years old and needed a walker to get around. Don't we all? The following month, he was extradited to Texas, where he was incarcerated at the Hidalgo County Sheriff Adult Detention Facility. There, he entered a plea of not guilty. The prosecution had requested a $750,000 bond, and his defense had asked for a $100,000 bond, saying that John had stage 3 kidney and bladder cancer, which, does that really have anything to do with anything? The judge eventually set his bond at $1 million. Hearings began being held in June and November later that year, and in February, the judge set the trial date for late April. When April rolled around, John's defense team had filed for a change of venue because they thought he wouldn't receive a fair and impartial trial in Hidalgo County. At this point, there were a lot of media reports mentioning John and detailing the crime. They also filed a 700-page document with evidence showing that local reporters had allegedly determined that John was a murderer and that he was able to evade consequences because he was protected by the Catholic Church for so many years. On May 24th, the judge heard arguments for the change of venue. This request was denied on June 7th after the judge decided that there was insufficient evidence presented to him that John would have received an unfair trial in this community. On July 19th, John appeared in court for a pre-hearing. After being pushed back several times, and after several months of strenuous jury selection, the trial began. On December 7th, 2017, John Fite was convicted of Irene Garza's murder. His attorney asked that John be sentenced to probation since he hadn't had any felony convictions since Irene's death. Which, I mean, wow, the audacity. The prosecution then asked for a sentence of 57 years to be given, as that was the amount of time that had passed since Irene's death. But the next day, the jury had pronounced a sentence of life in prison. John Fite was incarcerated at a facility in Huntsville, Texas, called Estelle Supermax Penitentiary, where he only served a short time before dying of natural causes on February 12th, 2020. I feel like we have a consensus on places that are generally safe and ones that aren't. I hope you take the best possible care of yourself and keep your guard up when something doesn't seem quite right. If you see something happening that shouldn't be, at the very least, tell someone, take care of each other, and just be careful. And that is all I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.